All right, good afternoon everyone, and most welcome to this seminar on the environment of lasting peace. I'm absolutely delighted that so many of you could make it, even though it's the middle of the afternoon, but the topic is obviously of great interest. My name's Robert Egnell. I have at least been for a long time the editor-in-chief of the magazine Human Security, or Mänsklig Säkerhet in Swedish. And this is a joint seminar led by the Swedish Development Forum and in collaboration with us. And these are two organizations really working in tandem for sustainable peace and prosperity, which is great that we then, for the first time, really have an opportunity to collaborate this way, collecting our respective audience in development and security issues. The topic of today, the relationship between sustainable peace and the environment, is an enormous one, and I'm absolutely delighted that we have three experts who from different perspectives can shed light on these issues. We are obviously facing tremendous challenges in terms of peace building generally, and when you add environmental and climate change to that mix, well, you have first of all, two separate enormous challenges, but also when you mix them together, a possible new brew of challenges. But there might also be opportunities in all of that. And we'll explore both the challenges and the opportunities today. I will introduce the speakers one by one, and Florian Krampe, he will introduce us in this very complex topic. He is a researcher in CIPRI's Climate Change and Risk Program. And he has a background from the Peace and Conflict Department in Uppsala, and that's where he has his schooling, and he is focused on peace and conflict research, but also then the environmental and climate change security aspects of that, which means he's the perfect introductory speaker for the topic of today. And the floor is all yours.
I think I need to press a button, right? Okay. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. As said, I'm working at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute in the Climate Change and Risk Program, where we focus on understanding climate-related security risks, understanding how institutions are responding to these risks, and with the aim to provide advice and recommendations to policy actors on how to better, more adequately respond to these risks. What I've studied the last 10-ish years in various, starting as a research assistant and then as a PhD candidate and then as a researcher, is essentially around the issue of peace building and how it links to environmental issues, and now I'm moving closer into like how that links to climate change issues. So what I'm going to do today is give you a brief reflection on my thoughts and some of the things I learned. It will be in parts very eclectic, jumping through different peace-building missions. I've studied several of them, but I thought I'd go along themes and try to highlight a few areas that I think are particularly relevant and give you the examples from these peace-building missions. So to start off with, building peace is rarely, if ever, straightforward, right? In fact, it's pretty complicated. And why it's complicated is something I want to explore now in the next 20 minutes or so by covering or focusing on three areas that are particularly relevant in my understanding and that show the challenges that peace building at the interlink to environmental issues is facing, looking at peace building missions stemming back to 99 essentially. So the first area that I'm going to focus on is politics, conflict, peace building, natural resource issues, environment. All of that is deeply political issues, and we need to understand that they are political and deal with them in a political way. The second area is it's complex, right? We titled the blog post we wrote on the topic before. The initial working title was like, it's complicated. And actually it is really complex, right? We have a lot of issues of coordination, of sequencing, and of different prioritizing and trade-offs that need to be made, and some of the trade-offs you can't really make well because you don't know enough. You don't know all the consequences. So I also want that my reflections are understood in that way, right? It's not like to assess a peace-building mission afterwards and say, why didn't you do that better? It's to learn the lessons from these missions and get a better understanding for our intervention in the future, and then maybe get a better understanding how, in cases such as Colombia, where the peace-building process is in the startup, and future peace-building missions where we can learn things about that. And the third area is climate change, climate-related security risks, how they're affecting conflict-affected populations and what the consequences are, but also what is climate change actually doing to peace operations and peace-building missions as such, right? It's all of a sudden a very, very different arena we are working in. So those are the three areas I will cover. I'll start off with some brief reflections on peace building as such. So if you look at the latest CPRI data on peace operations, we see that there are 63 active peace operations in the last year going on. And 13 of those were UN peacekeeping missions, right? Blue helmet missions, peace enforcement to some extent, soldiers on the ground. And many of these missions are in place for several decades, right? Some are in place essentially as long as the UN exists, looking at Israel and Palestine, looking at Kashmir between India and Pakistan. And what we see and learn from research is that peacekeeping is actually successful, right? In terms of ending violence, peacekeeping is doing a really good job. We see a lot of successes there, even though if those missions have to stay in place for several decades or half a century, if they're very successful in stopping violence. But of course, the challenge of post-conflict societies is not just to stop violence and stop a rekindling of violence. It's to move beyond the negative peace and setting societies up on a trajectory towards a positive peace, towards more inclusive internal relations, a positive development to get to a stable, lasting peace. And once we look at those factors, we see that the indirect, long-term effects of war are tremendously challenging, right? We look at many political and social aspects that are interwoven, lasting impressions of human rights abuses committed during the wars continue to shape the relations among members of societies for decades. The socioeconomic impacts, the political impacts, all challenge the stability of these countries for many, many years. The challenges to public health are especially severe and affect disproportionately the civilian population of these countries. So once we look at that, in the short run, considering many interacting processes seems exhausting, and admittedly, it seems complicated. And as such, it might be tempting, for example, to dismiss environmental issues, right? That would be the easy way out, because if you're facing you're in a post-conflict situation, stopping violence seems the priority, right? And everything connected to hard security, to the political violence element, seems to be the key focus. But of course, there's so many other things that we need to consider. And in terms of the environment, it's becoming increasingly clear that the interactions between social, political, as well as ecological processes decisively shapes the landscape of post-conflict societies. Environmental challenges and increasingly climate change expose these populations to new risks that we haven't faced before in this way, like Robert was alluding to. And we see that they are, in the long run, exaggerating the human cost of war long, even decades after the conflicts have ended. So recognizing that and acknowledging that, we have to also acknowledge that all too often the focus and the capacity of peace-building missions is limited to successfully navigate the impacts of war and simultaneously govern natural resources. Which brings me to the three areas I want to focus on, and I will weave in, as I said, several examples of peace-building missions. The first challenge is it's political, right? And I've studied the UN mission in Kosovo and looked at water supply issues. How many of you know that the UNMIC in Kosovo was essentially having a dedicated unit dealing with utility issues, right? Electricity, water, wastewater, right? I don't think many are aware of that, right? But that's one of the challenges. So aside from managing peacekeeping and politics and the everyday challenge of that, UNMIC had to deal with utilities. And we're in '99, we're at the height of liberal peace building, and the World Bank supported the processes around water sector reconstruction, structural adjustment, one of the key words, in an attempt to make the old socialist Yugoslav system on water sector management in Kosovo more efficient and yeah, let's keep it with more efficient. So we see in the implementation an expert-driven water resource management. What was assumed was like, well, the Serbs left, they were managing the water resources, so we assume there's no capacity on the ground, right? Like we do in so many peace-building missions. We assume local knowledge is simply not existent. We bring in external actors, external water companies that essentially come in and manage, win the contract and start managing the water in some of these villages and some of the enclaves. So we have a very functionalist way of approaching the issue. And of course, I mean, if any of us has a plumbing problem at home, you're not calling me as a political scientist, right? You're calling a plumber. You're calling an expert who knows how to fix the pipes. But of course, the problem is in Kosovo, none of the pipes is an engineering problem mostly, right? It's a political problem. So the easy engineering solution from building a pipe from A to B, which would be a straight line, is really complicated and difficult to do in a case like Kosovo, where everything is political, and we need to build a pipe which goes over 5 corners. And we see that in Mitrovica, a divided city in the north of Kosovo. The northern part is Serb-dominated, the southern part is Albanian-dominated. And once you start to look at the water sector or water supply, it becomes really interesting and intriguing, because the reservoir where the water for the city comes from is in the north. It's actually partially within Serbia. The water from there goes to the water treatment plant, which is in the south of Mitrovica, in the Albanian part, and from there gets distributed to South Mitrovica and North Mitrovica, right? So at some point, people have to talk, even though they don't want to. But there must be communication, because otherwise nothing works. And you have an interesting interdependence there, because nobody can switch off the water, right? If the Serbs switch off the water, the Albanians don't get water, but actually the Serbs don't get water either, and the other way around the same. So it's a really interesting dynamic, and it's deeply political. But the way that the UN mission managed the situation was actually by focusing on avoiding politics and avoiding conflicts, and just like let's pay the bill, right? Albanians that were supplying the water to the north weren't paid for the water supplied. Instead of finding a solution with the northern part, UNMIC decided we'll pay the bill, right? The north never reformed their water sector, the water supply, and the south got the money from the UN essentially to continue to supply water to the north. What that has done by avoiding politics in this situation is a factual separation of infrastructure in the long run, right? We have a Kosovo-Albanian infrastructure and we have a Serb infrastructure. We have an infrastructure that's divided along ethnic lines. We have avoided resolving the conflict using the interdependence that exists around water issues that would at least give us some leverage to force people to talk to each other in a different way. We haven't approached that. And at the same time, we have incapacitated local actors that would have been able to deal with the water sector and could have been trained in different ways to develop in managing the water resources. We have to, all that said, we have to acknowledge that around water issues, there wasn't any conflicts, right? There wasn't violence, at least. So on that end, the UN was good, but it didn't seize the opportunities and the possibilities that might have been there. The second part is, it's complex. You already get the sense from Kosovo, and I'm now going to talk about East Timor, Iraq, and Afghanistan to a little extent. And East Timor also in 1999, independence from occupation from Indonesia. The UN was already there, but a new UN mission came in, and the Interfed peacekeeping mission came in September after violence erupted, and was very successful in mitigating violence. One of the challenges for peacekeepers and peace builders coming into that context was you have a country that's essentially devastated by war, right? Dili was still on fire when the first UN missions or UN staff came in to deal with the response and rebuilding. And as a consequence, Interfed needed to use helicopters to fly thousands of bottles of water to peacekeepers that were dispersed all over the country. Right? One example of how difficult and complex these challenges are in relation to water, and how unsustainable a lot of those are in the short run. Right? There's simply no other option to deal with that. At least in that situation, there wasn't. And it shows one of the complexities. And secondly, it's complex. There's, especially in an emergency phase, like we see in the autumn of '99 in East Timor and the spring, the UN took essentially, even though the mission was approved in September, October, the UN took till spring 2000 to be on the ground. Right? You need to get all the staff, all the water actors. Another mission that had a dedicated water utility unit. Second problem, Kosovo was still going on, and a lot of the experts and were actually within Kosovo. Fun fact: Sergio de Mello was starting off both missions. So one of the challenges was water supply for the local population in this situation. And what many of the actors did was installing water pumps, right? Diesel-powered water pumps. The Red Cross did that. Several other NGOs did that. The UN wasn't for that, because some probably within the UN understood the long-term challenge that will come with that. Because what became evident later is that UNTAD, the UN mission, had to deal with the repercussions from all of that. Okay, I better speed up then. So people demanded fuel from the UN mission. It wasn't the UN installing those pumps, but people saw the UN mission as a legitimate follow-up of whichever NGO or actor was installing those pumps in the first place. And the UN had to deal with those issues, even though they were favoring a different water supply system. And what this shows is one example of the difficulty of coordinating between the short-term emergency relief and the long-term development planning, which is something we need to really work on. The short-term emergency, many actors, many different actors. The long-term development, very few actors, and very little communication in many instances between them. Just briefly, Iraq. 2003, among 20 UN agencies were active, and many working on overlapping issues, for instance, on water supply issues. And I want to talk a little bit about sequencing in these interventions. And we look at the marshland reconstruction in the southern parts of Iraq. In 2003, most of the country didn't have any water supply, right? People didn't have water supply. The water ministry and the US experts that were flown in to deal with the water sector reconstruction part were still trying to figure out what is the water infrastructure of Iraq actually, because it was a state secret, right? Because of the ethnic tensions and Saddam's policies, there wasn't any documentation out there. So they were trying to, not to figure out what works, but actually to see what the heck is there. UN Environment came in with a different priority, the marshlands, right? Restoring a biodiversity hotspot, labeled the Garden of Eden by many, and became something like a donor darling. A lot of focus on that. So within 2003, when half of the country didn't have water supply at home, drinking water available, other actors were focusing already on biodiversity. And I'm not against that, but I'm thinking there's an element of sequencing here where different priorities need to be sequenced and coordinated between different agencies. Because what we see in the long run, UNEP was dealing with water treatment plants and water supply in those areas. And has to acknowledge now, I spoke with a person that was in charge like this spring, it's like nothing that we did is functioning anymore today, right? So none of the water treatment stations are working. Most of the people that were envisioned to return to the marshlands, to the Garden of Eden, did not return because they were living for a decade within the cities or had moved to Iran. A similar lack, but a very different story we see in Afghanistan, and I'll be really brief in that. But it's a different factor of coordination, and I was surprised hearing these reflections of people in dealing with the peace-building mission and with the water sectors. They were essentially saying, well, there was not really an issue of coordination because, well, it's Afghanistan. If you want to build a dam, you build a dam. If you want to build a girls' school, you build a girls' school. Because there was nothing, right? There was simply enough space for every agency to act. With the problem that we don't have any coordination, we don't have a resilient infrastructure. It's maybe hard to expect that given the context of Afghanistan, of course, but we see the repercussions today, which brings me to the last point, right? The issue of climate change. Afghanistan is facing a tremendous, major famine, and part of that is due to climate factors, to an ongoing drought in the region. Part is due to a lack of a functioning managing infrastructure for water resources to support irrigation in the areas. You might have seen last week the headlines that more people in Afghanistan were displaced by the famine than by the conflict. Be that as it may, I think it shows a failure of developing irrigation infrastructure and building a resilient community infrastructure, a failure to invest within the right sectors. We had a failure in Afghanistan in 2001 to invest in agriculture, to give farmers alternative livelihood options in the crops they farm, which led in consequence to poppy seed farming, right? And because that was the only thing available and the only alternative. I wanted to talk about Iraq, but I think I'm out of time, and give you just an example, or probably just give you a recommendation to read the report by the expert working group on climate-related security risks that CIPRI is hosting with several other organizations, which has the aim to inform UN agencies about the security risks and give more ad hoc risk assessment of these regions. And just in Iraq, we see an increase of climate-related security risks. We see communal tensions around access and food of water. We see that specifically in the marshlands, actually, diminishing agricultural livelihoods. And in the long run, all of these failures to invest properly within the agriculture sector, which is the least funded ministry, is providing a fertile ground for recruitment for various actors in this conflict, among others, Islamic State. So, considering environmental issues is complicated, yet what becomes increasingly clear from the research that we have on those issues is that it is inevitable for moving beyond negative peace. To move towards a more positive, sustainable peace, we need coordinated strategic dealings across actors. We need recovery plans that no longer exclude the management of environment, natural resources, and the strengthening of societies for resilience and to climate impacts. We need much stronger central UN leadership to lift environmental issues in the humanitarian response and coordinate those. I wouldn't be a researcher if I wouldn't raise the issue that we need much more research on the issue to understand the risks, but also to understand the dilemmas, because once everything is interacting, nothing is easy, and everything is affecting something else. And we need to come to a point where our trade-offs that we do, where we actually know about them, where we know, okay, I know that will have an effect on local communities in this way, so I can already work on a contingency plan to deal with that, right? To prevent maladaptation. I'm convinced that that is a possibility, and I think research is indicating that with the right support, the challenges that I discussed are actionable. We're actually able to transform them into opportunities to achieve environmental protection, climate resilient communities, and by extension, build a more sustainable peace. Thank you.
Please stay, Florian. Before we start discussing this, I'd like to ask you one question, because that was an excellent summary. But if we find ourselves in a post-conflict situation like the one in Iraq, and we know the post-conflict reconstruction was an absolute mess, the planning for that. But if you were the political advisor to the commander on the ground at that stage, what would have been your brief pitch not to wait when it comes to natural resources, water sharing issues, environmental issues, for that process to begin? First to draft a peace plan and etc. But rather deal with it now as part of the peace process rather than wait. What's the key arguments there?
I think they were already doing that in Iraq before, actually during the invasion. The US Army Corps of Engineers was already planning the water sector response, essentially, in the time after. The guy in charge, I forgot his name, was essentially trying very hard to talk to everyone he knew who was Iraqi and had anything to do with the water sector, to get an understanding of the water sector. So I think the planning is already there. The problem becomes that in this situation, we have too many actors, and we don't have a coordinated response and a response that says stop to some actors, right? Like that actually puts the foot down and says, wait here. Your time will come, and then the resources will come in. And I think that relates to the funding structures that we have, right? Because everyone will shop around to the donors, and UNEP was very successful with that for the marshlands, because of this imagery of the Garden of Eden, right? And which gives you simply the capacity to act. I think we need a stronger coordination role. That's one of the key things. Yeah,
and then probably the UN leading the mission rather than an international coalition, if we want that coordination.
I guess fighting the war on terror did neither help in Afghanistan nor in Iraq.
Thank you very much, Florian. Maybe you want to rest your legs for a few minutes while our two next speakers come up here, because I would like for both of you to come up at this stage. I'd like you to introduce you to Carina Barquet, who's a research fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute. And she has one of those backgrounds that I always envy, a truly multidisciplinary background in human geography, development studies, and peace and conflict studies, which means you're a rare beast as well, because we tend to have people studying climate change, environmental issues on the one side, and the security scholars on the other. And there are very few who are actually marrying these two together, trying to make sense of that interrelationship between politics and our environmental issues. But you're one of those. But you're also another hybrid scholar. You are both doing the theoretical, groundbreaking work, but you also do applied research, and that makes you extremely interesting to talk to in this setting. We also have Claudia Arenas with us, who is currently the head of impact and quality assurance at Forum Syd. But for this occasion, I think your previous position as regional manager in Colombia is even more interesting. And you have many years of experience working on the ground with the local actors, especially civil society in Colombia, on these grueling years of working towards a peace plan, failing in terms of not getting the referendum in the right direction, but then overwinning that as well. You've been part of that whole process. So to learn from you about how these local actors worked on these issues, it will also be incredibly interesting. But I'm going to ask you, Carina, to start. You're also a little bit critical, if I understand. So please.
Yes, a bit critical to most things, but it's going to be a little bit hard to live up to that description. I wish I should introduce you to my boss next time I have my development and salary talk. I think could help me there. I would actually like to pick up on Florian's Kosovo, because I think you don't exactly frame that question, but I think it's referring to a fundamental question in the area and the field of environmental peace building, which is whether environmental issues can be used as points of departure for cooperation, or whether we need cooperation in the first place to start talking over environmental issues. And this is an ongoing question. There's been many studies, but it's very difficult to establish the causality in this relation. What affects what? And it's a bit of a chicken and an egg thing. I've studied this. I couldn't come up with a better answer except it's a chicken and an egg. And that, of course, context matters, but I'm a geographer, so for us, context always matters. But I would like to stress some key things when it comes to the relationship between resources and conflict. And the first is geography, of course, and the second is timing. When it comes to geography, I don't know how much you know about this. This is quite classic peace and conflict, natural resources background. But there's a very different relation depending on what resource you're talking about. Different natural resources have different linkages to different types of conflict. So if you take resources like lootable resources, easily lootable resources like forests, biodiversity, and some types of diamonds, those are quite clearly linked to certain types of conflict like rebel groups and that kind of sort of more localized, less organized conflict, which doesn't depend so much on high technology to be able to exploit a resource. Whereas if you look at oil or other types of resources that require more technology, that's more related to state conflict. So I'm just going to stick to the easily lootable resources because this is quite relevant for the case in Colombia. Many easily lootable resources like forests are also areas high in biodiversity. And many of these areas are often found along borders. And borders are also areas, especially in the Latin American context, where states have historically very little control over. They're usually far away from capitals. There's always a history of conflict with some other neighboring country. And so all of these factors create the right conditions for hiding rebel groups, easily, again, exploiting resources, forming parallel societies that go under the radar of the state. And all of these conditions are present in the case of Colombia, I would say. Unfortunately, these are also areas which we, the environmental global community, are trying to protect. But I think you might by now understand that there is a problem here because we're trying to protect areas that are problematic for states. And if you protect them, that could also foster or sort of even support at some point rebel groups, whilst what the state is trying to do is to establish better contact to these areas through infrastructure, for example, better roads, etc. So this is a big challenge. The second is when it comes to timing, and that's environmental peace building projects. They require very long time. And very often these interventions are short, 3-4 years of a project that a donor is happy about, and then it ends, and then you pull out, and then you just make the issue even worse. The second is when you go in. The time of the intervention is also very important. If you go in under an armed conflict, well, that's almost impossible. If you go right after, it's too sensitive. If you go too much after, so the timing is very important here. And just to wrap up, I'm going to Afghanistan now. I think one key for Colombia is going to be a challenge. Is going to find sustainable solutions that are not just environmentally and climate aware or that benefit the climate or the environment. I think you're going to have to find solutions that also benefit, especially economically, the groups that today depend on one of the strongest and most stable markets, which is cocaine and the drug market, to be able to have enough revenues to support all of these people that were once forced to go into those markets. And I do think that there are opportunities within Agenda 2030 and within the circular economy, which I won't touch upon now, but there is some light at the end of the tunnel, I think.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. A brief question and a general criticism in this field I think, is that we tend to be very top-down focused when it comes to peace building, post-conflict reconstruction, etc., rather than build societies from the bottom up. So my question to you is, are the actors on the ground interested in these issues, or is this an international community issue that we're trying to push on them? And if they are interested, who are they, and for what reasons are they interested?
That's a huge question, but there's different types of interventions. A lot of the environmental interventions that I've looked at, they are focusing on protecting, and that is counterintuitive with what communities need, because it's not that local communities don't see or don't rely or don't even value the environment. It's just that protection is not the way to go. So the top-down approach is to protect, to prohibit, without giving any alternative. Without really addressing the core problem that got us there in the first place. Whilst I think I agree with you, if you would work more bottom-up and with communities in mind, the alternatives would look slightly different. It would be, I would say they should be more steered towards use, but in a different way, and in controlling abuse from those who are actually causing the problems in the first place, which are rarely local communities.
Excellent. We'll come back to that issue, but I wanted to bring in Claudia and the perspective from Colombia, and it's the perfect sort of zooming in right now to a particular case that all three of you know it, which means we can have a really thorough discussion on that particular case, while also then being possibly able to extrapolate that discussion into broader and more generalizable issues. Mm-hmm. But please enlighten us.
Okay, I will get back to your question now about how people on the ground see this, and especially environmental issues. And I would say it's definitely not only an issue for the international community, but when it comes to how communities are seeing environment, it has to do with natural resources. Mm-hmm. It has to do with their projects of life in their lands, and it definitely has to do with development as well. And I will build up to that. Colombia has been having a 60-year armed conflict, some say even longer. And I would say it shows very well how violence and peace building is a continuum, and how important it is not to neglect or not to ignore the capacity of people in the ground. In Colombia, basically what we have had during these 60 years is a naturalization of violence. And in many places in Colombia, normality is actually what you could see even in Sweden. In some places in Bogota, you will never feel the conflict. So, and that's very linked to what you were saying, it's in spots of the country, 60-year-long violence, but at the same time that means also that direct violence is seen as a problem, while structural violence is actually seen as natural, is part of what the society is. And this is a very rich country, but it's highly unequal, and I would say its culture is anti-democratic. It's not respectful in terms of difference and in terms of building up from different points of view and managing conflict in a non-violent way. What was in the center of or what has been in the center of the armed conflict in Colombia is land. But land as a natural resource, and then also it is about natural resources below. So now it's not only about the land and about coca and about poppy, about marijuana, but it's also about oil and it's also about mining. And if we look at the peace agreement that was reached between the Colombian government and the FARC 2 years ago, basically it focused on land reform, the solutions to these peasants that have been growing coca and have been growing marijuana and have been growing poppy flower, and at the same time guaranteeing transitional justice, some truth, at least, maybe some justice, and a little bit of political participation to the FARC guerrilla. The thing here is that the implementation, peace building, you said it, Florian, is complicated. I would say one of the main issues why this is complicated is because this has to have the ownership of the society. It's not something that you can impose. It's something that has to come from the bottom up. And it's a contested matter in Colombia right now. It's not only because of the referendum 2 years ago. I would say right now the country is very much polarized in two different sectors. One which goes very well with what has been written in the peace agreement, and another which actually would prefer to go back in terms of what the peace agreement reached, especially in regards to the political participation of the FARC and in regards to the way the problem of coca is being approached. And there what we see is also that about environment was never in the center of the discussion. Nonetheless, the environment for the communities that were living the conflict always has been crucial. And the reason why it was not included is because if you have to negotiate 60 years of war, you have to focus on the most important issues. And that's a departure point. You can't negotiate everything. Actually, the peace negotiation table that the past government, the Santos government, had opened with the ELN guerrilla, another guerrilla in Colombia that has not yet reached peace, included environment. But that peace table has been closed now by the current government. With the FARC, it was land, and it was the drugs, and that was the issue. And I would say the other thing here was that the environment did not have enough advocates, as, for example, did the gender issue. Gender came to the table in La Habana, in Cuba, between the FARC and the government because women movement put it there. The women movement in Colombia pushed it up to the negotiation table, and it was not the same with the environmental issues. And what we have seen also is that development was not part of the debate because the government didn't want it to be part of the debate. And as I said, in the case of Colombia, natural resources and environment are very, very strongly linked. Just to wrap up there, what are we having now is that very, very similar as we have seen in Central America. Now the debate is about environment, sustainability, and what the development model will be for Colombia. Extractivism, especially oil and other minerals, is very strong. Colombia, for example, has accepted fracking as a methodology to exploit oil, which we know has a very, very, very negative environmental impact. And what we see is communities on one hand that want to not conserve, or conserve with people. But they even have, for example, a project where they call natural parks with people, not take people out of the territory, but allow that this becomes sustainable and protect water and protect forest. And on the other side, all this idea that development has to come hand in hand with the revenues of oil and minerals. So that tension is what we're living right now in Colombia. And around that, there is a high risk that conflicts will rise again and that violence will increase again.
Thank you so much. I'd like to ask you immediately then, if you were giving the almighty powers to rewrite the peace agreement.
Oh my God.
With a perspective on these issues, what would you bring into the peace agreement? Or does it include the foundations for, because it doesn't necessarily have to be written in the text, it can also just be implied, so that there's opportunities to work on these issues within the current framework. So you don't have to rewrite it if you don't want to. But
actually, that was what I was going to say. I think within the peace agreement, I have to explain there a little bit. Within the component of land reform, there was this idea of creating territorial development plans. And these territorial development plans would have required a good dialogue between the government, communities, and private sector. In the paper, it looks very good. In reality, we know that it's not necessarily the way it was planned, and the dialogue was very scarce, and the real possibility for communities to present their proposals and to debate what their development of their land would be, of their region in Colombia, was very low. So actually, I would not rewrite it. I would just give the opportunity for that to happen. And I definitely agree with what you were saying, Karina, that takes time. That's not something that we as international community see so quick. And you have to be patient. And patience is difficult, but patience is fundamental for peace building.
Peace takes time.
Exactly.
Karina, you briefly mentioned, Florian, please join us now in the panel. We're smoothly getting into the panel discussion here. You briefly mentioned the circular economy in relation to Colombia. Could you please expand on that a little bit in relation to what Claudia just said?
Yes, I think within the circular economy there is a lot of potential because it's new, it's innovative, it requires public-private partnerships. There is gains at least promise gains to be made for a broader group of people. And the idea then is to reuse things that we've ditched for many, many years. So make use of the trash that we've thrown away for a long time and instead get it back into that circle, into that process. I think that this is not particular for Colombia. This is really everywhere. I don't know if any of you read the discussions this summer on food security in Sweden after the trade war. Right after Almedalen, Isabella Lövin and environmental minister, which I forgot her name, not because I forgot her, but yes, Carolina Skog, thank you, came out being quite explicit and critical to the level of insecurity we have in Sweden in terms of food. There was a bit of a funny article saying we are only secure in carrot cake. If there would be a crisis, an intervention, a real trade war, Sweden would survive on carrot cake. I'm sure your 5-year-olds would be happy about it, not so sure about the rest. And then being food secure means we also need to have security on the foundation of food, all the elements that make our food grow, which is phosphorus. Today we depend on phosphorus from war-driven countries, and which are located in extremely geopolitical difficult situations. The alternative is to rely on Russia for phosphorus. And so the only alternative to this too is circularity, to reuse the phosphorus that we've been throwing away into our oceans, that are polluting our oceans. So this circularity is not just a Colombia thing. This is really everywhere. I think circularity is not only an environmental issue anymore. It is a security issue as well.
Mm-hmm. You all in different ways talked about the most important issues, sequencing, prioritizing, etc. For me, in my own research on human security, that's sort of exactly what it's about. Who determines what the most important issues are? Normally, when you do a conflict analysis, according to the textbook taught at the Peace and Conflict Department, for example, you start out with who are the actors, then what are their interests and how are they conflicting, and then you try and find resolutions between these conflicting interests. The problem is then how you determine who the actors are. They're usually the violent actors or the political leaders of different fighting groups, not the communities on the ground. Mm-hmm. And if you ask them what are the most important issues, their stories are quite often, almost always, I would say, completely different than the most important actors, so to speak. They're highlighting food security, education, etc., quite often not related to the warring parties as much as one would think. Mm-hmm. So the question then is, how do we bring in these communities to a larger extent? And this was a huge thing in Colombia when these actors, especially the women's movement, was brought into the process. Things actually started moving. What are your suggestions there?
I mean, maybe just starting on the broadest level, I mean, especially in the context of Colombia, I'm really curious to see how things turn out, right? Everything I studied is sort of like in the height of the liberal peace building times, right? Very different times, and I'm not many academics in the field have noticed that, but when you talk more to the peace building action policy actors, civil society actors, you realize, times have changed. We're not in this only top-down debate anymore, right? We have a completely different agenda guiding the UN on sustaining peace, which is much broader, which highlights conflict prevention, which highlights inclusivity, right? So I'm really curious how this changed, the actual lessons that we learned from how things did not work out always the way they were intended in the liberal peace times. How this is now going to play out in Colombia, and maybe that's too early to really say and see, but it will be really interesting. I think we're in a time when this paradigm is really changing and when the communities are becoming more central.
Well, I of course I'm curious also of how it will end. Not only because of work, also because I'm Colombian. But I would say I'm actually a cautious optimist in the case of Colombia. And I would say that even there's a lot of things in a peace agreement that you could use to make it sustainable. As I mentioned also, for example, these little frames that were created for the participation of communities. It is very important to have an oversight from international community here. And the reason is because this can be used in any direction possible. And actually the whole infrastructure for peace building was not taken away by the current government, although the current government, or although the candidate that now is president during the candidacy said that he will tear the agreements apart. And it becomes a little bit suspicious when that person that said he would finish the agreements now is using all the infrastructure that was created by the agreements. And you kind of ask yourself, okay, what is he and his government going to do with this infrastructure if he was against of the agreements? So that's where I see that international community that supported the negotiation should stay on to see that all these sectors that were in favor of the peace agreement, that are at the other side of this government, really are integrated into the peace building. A second thing I would see there is the need of strengthening the peace mission. The peace mission to Colombia is basically a peacekeeping, very, very transitory, only focusing at the beginning on the ceasefire between the FARC and the government, and that's quite dangerous. And what we have seen is an increase of violence against social leaders, and they are not protected by the peace mission. That should be included. And actually it's a sad thing, because it was a lesson learned from previous peace missions that you should have all this infrastructure for human rights that you have with the High Commissioner of Human Rights, and that has been neglected to some extent in Colombia. So that should be strengthened in order to give people the possibility to participate, actually. And then I would say that one thing that we as Forum Syd have been working on very strongly is developing dialogue for change and working with the communities, and also trying to have alliances with other people who are closer to institutions and private sector to produce that change and that exchange and dialogue between the different actors. And I would say that if others, like for example you, are working with institutions and we are working with civil society from the international perspective, what we can be is a bridge builder, a trust builder, because that's the difficult thing here. Building trust so that people just sit together and start discussing about development, about solving these more in-depth issues to change the society and transform the society, and thus get to lasting peace.
Yeah. Could I add one quickly thing?
Absolutely.
So at this, I mentioned before that I think there are opportunities within Agenda 2030, and I think this is where I see the opportunities within localization, because Agenda 2030, the next step is to trickle down from the state, blah, blah, to the actual action in cities. And this is not because I'm fond of global discourses that don't lead to anything, but in this case I think Agenda 2030 could lead to anything simply because there's a lot of force within the private sector. There's a lot, for some reason, apparently this has established some sort of security within financing institutions, setting the world towards a vision up until 2030. And this has sort of secured the private sector towards making investments in different areas. And so if a premise then is to align and to sort of comply with Agenda 2030 to get these investments, then I think there is like a major incentive for governments to start thinking more towards Agenda 2030 at local areas, in cities, taking into account the actual local realities rather than what the capital cities say. So this is just what I wanted to add.
Really context-specific work on these issues, so to speak. Yeah. So in your applied research, Karina, what concrete ways have you found to introduce these issues, environmental and climate-related issues, into peace agreements or peace-building processes? Are there any instruments that we can use that do work?
I haven't worked with introducing things. I've worked with trying to understand how people perceive these more global discourses, but also trying to understand how, at implementation, how global discourses, for example, for protection, biodiversity protection, forest protection, how do they get translated by people in local areas? And very often I found that we're not really talking about different things, we're just talking about it differently. And what differs then are sort of, it's not even the aims, we all want to go towards the same area. We all are interested in protecting and having a more sustainable life. It's just the gains and who gains from what is quite different. so I would say the process, I think what could make a big difference is changing the process on how projects or decisions are made. Not just, I mean, of course, one thing you mentioned, including people, but also the way you frame the problem. Who is framing the problem and what is the problem about? It's a very different thing when you take into account the local realities and when, again, capital cities or international researchers frame the problem.
Excellent. It's already complicated enough, but I thought I would bring in another factor, and that's the gender dimension. So if we add that to the mix of peace, environmental issues, are there any particular areas that you would highlight from a gender perspective?
Okay, maybe I start then. In the case of Colombia, what we have seen is that actually one very strong advocator to start discussing the environmental issues have been women in the communities, and have been women's organizations. There is a strong link between women, youth organizations, and environment from the bottom up in the case of Colombia. And in the case of women, it is very strongly related, as it is also in Central America, for example, because environmental impact or climate change is affecting natural resources, and as women are the primary take cares, and water and food, etc., is so fundamental for caretaking, they are the ones that raise their voice first. And I would say the interesting thing here is that they not only raise their voice first, but they are looking at the problem in a more comprehensive way. Because then they are connecting this extractive economy, the armed conflict per se, and also all these environmental impacts of the extractive economy and climate change at the same time. What I would say is that it is important to continue strengthening the voice of women that are working with this and supporting them to network between them on a regional, national, in this case Latin American level and also global level, because this is happening in different parts of the world. And I would say solutions around how to deal with this are being built up in different parts of the world, and it's so important to have an exchange between them about this. And then I would say that it's definitely necessary to validate their voices. You were saying it's not that we're talking about different things, it's that we're talking about them in different manners. And the thing is that the voice of the person that is living in the ground should be as valid as the voice of the expert that is coming in. And that I think is kind of difficult because there is a power relation. And that to overcome that power relation is fundamental to not only do that link between gender and environment, but also to guarantee that communities are owning the peace building. So I would say all of that could be things to include there, to make it a little bit more complex, as you say.
Yeah, thank you.
I would like to sort of broaden this to talk about social equality and social equity, which gender is included in these categories, because then we are talking about vulnerability and exposure, and we're not just talking about whether you identify as a man or a woman or whatever it is. It's also about, it talks about the most exposed and the most vulnerable in society, regardless of age, sex, or any other categories. And often the most vulnerable are always the ones also left behind. So this, again, links quite well with all international agreements when it comes to disaster, when it comes to sustainability, when it comes to Paris. Vulnerability is a key word here, which then captures gender as well, I would say.
Yeah. I want to add two things, I think. I think natural resources and those issues are very close to affect gender dynamics and women and men alike. For example, in the research in Nepal that I did on micro hydropower development, right, we see tremendous effects on the farming, right, and it breaks up some of those. The way it was actually implemented in Nepal was so much better than in East Timor. UNDP, as part of the package of getting micro hydropower into the region, into the villages, divided or made groups that deal with different issues, right? And traditionally, decisions around which crop to grow and things like that are male decisions. And through that change, through those user groups on the ground that were generating actually a change in the decision-making processes, right? So it was different groups, and it was women that made decisions about what crop to grow. In East Timor, we saw around the water issue an exclusion of women in the issues, which is such a lost opportunity because those are the main water users, right? And we see negative effects in terms of the sustainability of the water systems that were installed. In Nepal, we see a much different dynamic. The impact it had on the communities in getting micro-hydropower there changed agriculture. It changed, obviously, getting electricity into the village, which all of a sudden freed up time for women because one could get a rice boiler, which saved time in terms of collecting firewood and cooking rice. And you see such a positive development in the interviews I was fortunate to make. You saw like a change that, like, hey, look, we're discussing politics now. We should do that more often, right? And simply like having that time available and having that change in society is really one of the tremendous opportunities that can come with smart, sustainable natural resource management, I think.
I would like to add another example to the one that you were giving, Florian, which is a project that indigenous women in Colombia have called Harvesting Rain. Colombia, and here I'm getting into geography, sorry, a little bit, you know, the Andean chain, it breaks up in three in Colombia. Then we have two big valleys, inter-Andean valleys. One of them is very, very dry. And in that valley, indigenous women have found a way of harvesting rain, of collecting the humidity. And that actually has propelled them politically within their organization and then within the frame of indigenous organizations in Colombia. So actually, yes, it's not only that they are creating a solution for the drought, that they are creating a solution in regards to access to water, but also that is having a link directly to their empowerment in other issues, because now they are a valid voice, because they innovated and they built a solution that was important for all, and men could not, not recognize it. So that was quite interesting, and I think it's very much like you were saying.
And I think there's an element of that, what you're saying, the success of those, we see the same in Nepal, right? The success of getting these projects into the villages is one of the key drivers of empowerment, right? In various ways, but especially also around the genders.
So there's a story by Don Steinberg, who was the deputy administrator of USAID for many years. But long before that, he was the chief negotiator for the United States in the peace process in Angola. And they achieved a tremendous success, a peace agreement. And he was awarded the ambassadorship because of that great success. But it all broke down into civil war again. And he was soul-searching for the rest of his life. Since then, he's been soul-searching whatever went wrong, highlighting the importance of different actors with different backgrounds around the negotiating table as well, because what he could remember was there were 30 warlords on one side and 30 warlords on the other. They gave each other impunity for everything they had done and what they would do the next 6 months. But that's aside the story here. But what they missed was also some really important factual information. For example, they decided that they would demine the country. And no one in that room knew exactly how to do that. So they decided to demine the roads, which for the men around the table was the most important part. He always said that if only one woman had been there, and women are obviously ones collecting firewood for cooking, collecting water, working the fields, etc., they would immediately have highlighted that you need to demine outside of the roads, in the countryside where we live, where we collect our wood and gather our water, etc. But no one around that table understood that, which meant as soon as people started moving back, there was a second humanitarian disaster in Angola with enormous amounts of people becoming victims of mines. And I think that cuts to both the bottom-up understanding of the issues on the ground and also the gender dimension. We do need different perspectives on these issues. I have so many questions left, but there's also so much expertise in the room, so it would be completely wrong of me to hijack this discussion. So please, I'd like to involve you at this stage. There is a microphone, I believe. Anyone who would like to jump in, and please do introduce yourselves and keep your remarks or questions short.
Hello, I'm Thomas Nordberg from Peace Quest International, and I was wondering about the issue of amnesty of former FARC combatants. How much of a contentious issue is that in Colombia?
It's a huge contentious issue. Okay, that is strongly related to the transitional justice system that was created in the peace agreement. And I would start by saying that it was a very contested issue during the peace negotiation, and it was also a high issue on the debate around the referendum 2 years ago, and it has been a high debate issue for the implementation, because the whole debate was if there was going to be 100% amnesty, and it's not. I mean, according to the peace agreement, it's not. There's a very strong focus on truth. And then on one side were the people who were saying truth is not enough. We want real punishment for the FARC. And then on the other side, people who were saying truth is important, but from all the sides of the conflict. So the debate becomes very complex, because after 60 years of war, it's very hard to say that any actor in Colombia is untouched by it, or that especially power actors have not been involved to some extent. What has happened after the change of the government, which was in August 7th this year, is that actually the whole infrastructure for transitional justice has been started to be mined. So on one side, some of the high-level chiefs of the FARC have been imprisoned. Some others have the threat that they might be extradited to the United States of America because they were involved in drug dealing. As we all know, they even recognized it, that the FARC did that. And at the same time, private companies do not have to go to the truth system, and many private companies, even international companies, have been involved in crimes of war in Colombia. The military will not go through that transitional justice system. They will continue going to military tribunals, so that there will not be truth there. And many of the politicians will not go to the truth system, to the transitional system. So all in all, there is a high risk that not even the truth will be reached, and that justice is quite far away. It's sad, but yeah.
Another, yes, please.
Hello, my name is Anne-Sophie. I work at CEDA at the Africa Department on Environment and Climate Change issues. I'm wondering, through your research, I mean, we see now more and more, I think, I mean, just at least in the countries where I'm focusing on, Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia, we see more these multi-sectoral programs, including, I mean, integrated water resource management, agriculture, peaceful societies, components, natural resource management. But through your research, are there any, I mean, what are the important components in these kind of programs to be successful? And then my second question would be, I'm not sure I got your point on circularity that you mentioned several times. So could you please repeat that again?
Thank you. I think that we're seeing much more programs, like you described, is one of the side effects of a changing global agenda on those issues, right? The peace-building discourse changes. What we need to be really careful with is that we don't do the mistakes of the past just in different closing, right? Issues like integrated water resource management is not a traditional Somali concept, for example. It's not a traditional Afghani concept of water management. And we see that actually in the case of Afghanistan. I'm doing a study at the moment there, where that is one of the key problems. The user committees don't work. We're bringing in an external foreign concept, which might make sense again, right? The picture of the plumber versus the political scientist. Not realizing or not making it work in a way that, in the case of Afghanistan, would work with the traditional MIRAB system, right? The MIRAB is a local person elected, highly legitimate, who has a long-standing experience in managing the water resources in the communities. There are really good elements of things like integrated water resource management, but we need to not make the mistake to bring exactly the same, right, the cookie cutter approach to put the same thing everywhere. We need to adapt those. We need to have also, I think, more iterative processes around that and see and realize that it doesn't work, and how can we fix that, right? How can we change small things within the framework to get a better outcome possibly?
With regards to the circular economy question, so what I meant was that I think the circular economy presents us with an alternative to resource extraction, which many countries depend on both for production, like in Colombia, you have one of the biggest coal mine productions in the world, but also when it comes to consumption, which we at the other end of the world, we consume through various things, for example, phosphorus, which was my example, and contribute to mining for new minerals and other sources. It could also be an alternative for, instead of using fresh water for things, you actually reuse water resources in a different way in contexts where you have water scarcity, which is very many parts of the world, even less traditional parts of the world, like Sweden, we are facing water scarcity. So if you can steer away production, specifically, for example, mining activities, which are highly environmentally polluting, very political, and in many areas, for example, in Colombia, a source of conflict between locals, the state, and mining companies. And instead of just removing it and leaving lots of people out of jobs, you just, it sounds very easy, I don't know how you do it, but instead of just removing that source of income and that source of employment, you just change the system so that it's a circular system, that instead of mining new resources, you use the resources that you have in the oceans, in the water, in the land, etc. So exactly how, I don't really have a recipe for it today. I'm sure it depends on the resource and on the context. But I think it presents interesting opportunities in different contexts. Did I make myself clear? Yes.
We have focused on post-conflict peace building today. I'm just wondering how many of these lessons are relevant for conflict prevention as well? And if so, why?
We're thinking here.
Go on.
Maybe I can start with an idea. I would say definitively what we have seen has a high potential also for conflict prevention in terms of a conflict being managed in a non-violent way. I mean, I would say that Colombia, sadly, is a country specialized in conflict because of all these years. And one thing that we have identified is that managing conflicts in a non-violent way is crucial, not only to overcome the violence, but also to prevent new violence surging. The example that you were giving about Angola, I think we have seen all around the world, and it's so common that after a peace agreement you have a new conflict, or in different settings you have new violent conflict. I would say in Latin America, in different parts of Latin America, there's a lot of potential for violent conflicts, subnational violent conflicts, that could be dealt with by all these things that we have mentioned today, by alternatives around natural resources. If we just think about Central America, for example, there's very high potential for more violent conflict in Central America around natural resources where ideas like circular economy or the ideas that you were presenting about this link between environment and peace building and politics and climate change are crucial, and even more because of climate change and the vulnerability of all the societies towards climate change.
Thanks. Any other comments?
Yeah, I can add just on some of the thinking on conflict prevention. I think it's really important and equally difficult, because one of the issues with conflict prevention is always that you don't really know if it worked, because you don't have a. If you don't have a conflict, you don't know if there would have been one. Yeah. I think all of the things we talked about and we touched upon are feeding into conflict prevention, and if we just change the timing to not the post-conflict frame, inclusion is usually a good recipe for stability, right? Sustainable management of resources, if you look at climate-related security risks, the risks to livelihood, then interventions that build resilience of communities and makes them more resilient to climate impacts, for example, is probably something that feeds into conflict prevention. The problem is that we can't really measure that, right? It's difficult to know how strong you need to build the house for the storm, right? The conflict prevention house, and we have various tools and we know various things, but how strong does it need to be? I think all of that feeds into that discussion, but we need to emphasize the research in that area to increase our understanding of those dynamics, and to broaden our understanding of peace also, right. With that, right? To not just, okay, one expression is violence, but maybe to come to a more process-oriented measuring of peace. If legitimacy of the government is deteriorating, that might not be direct violence, but that might be a red warning light to do something. And if we see it improve, we have something that helps on conflict prevention. And we see those things work actually with natural resource management in terms of providing services, right? Having this relationship between the state and society functioning, those basic social contract things.
For me, I think it boils down again to good governance, institutions, the social contract between the state and its inhabitants and so on. And it's, I mean, coming from a country which is where Colombia was at some point, in Mexico, it's not really declared a country in war, but there's been more deaths than in Afghanistan. So again, what is war? What is peace? I think that in this case, the international community, they can't change a whole culture. They can't change structural violence or structural corruption, but they can set premises on where do you invest as an international, what private, but also investor, but also where do you give aid? I think some premises could be put forward, and they could be much tougher than they are on countries that don't live up to what they should be living up to as democracies, like my own country. And the rest, I think, that it has to come from within. Maybe you have the recipe.
No, I don't. I don't. But I do find it fascinating to think about the root causes of conflict. Of course, a useful peace-building process needs to try and tackle the original root causes of that conflict. And if it doesn't, if it just addresses whatever the fighting parties are concerned about, it's probably not going to be a sustainable peace. And it seems to me quite often the environment has quite an impact on those root causes. And during the Arab Spring, we could see the rise of bread because of drought for a few years. Little changes that had an enormous impact on societal relations that broke down into violence. Democratic processes in some countries, very violent processes in others. But it's always there. And it seems to me that we're on to something, both in terms of building peace afterward, but also in terms of a resilient society is in a very broad sense, is most likely to be a non-conflict one as well. But that's also in the disaster management research. They always make that distinction between a disaster and a climate event, for example, that the event might be a natural cause, but the disaster, that is always man-made because it's related to the resilience of that society to tackle whatever the event was. And perhaps we have similar things to think about when it comes to peace and war and peace processes after conflict as well. Yes, another question from Sida.
I'm just wondering if you could say something about climate change as a driver of conflict or as a multiplier of conflict. I mean, as far as I understand, the research is more, I mean, is saying that we shouldn't see climate change as sort of the driver of the conflict. It's more a multiplier of the conflict. Yeah.
I think research is inconclusive.
Yeah.
It's, Florian, you probably can talk more about it, but of all the studies, you can take the exact same data set and reach a complete different conclusion. So we know it plays a role. We don't know, again, the causality of it or to what extent. But that's my understanding. Maybe you have a different understanding, Gloria.
I don't think I can give you a short answer. But I recommend you to check Sipri's work on this issue. I think there are multiple things to keep in mind. One is what Robert said, right? Environmental factors, climate factors. They play a role, right? And it would be foolish to say they don't. But it takes somebody to take up a gun. Mm-hmm. And climate change doesn't do that, right? So we need to keep that in mind also, that there is an agency of conflict involved. There's not an inevitability, right, roughly, in that, but there are tremendous risks. And there is by using the term risk, we acknowledge that there's a way of managing that. And it depends how good we are in our responses in terms of conflict prevention, in terms of intervening, to address those risks at an early stage before they break out, right? That said, I think we see what our research shows is we're talking about climate-related security risks. And we see that climate impacts on livelihoods, climate impacts on migration patterns or changes in mobility patterns, climate impacts on infrastructure, all have links to political violence. That is not to say that there is a necessity in it, that one leads inevitably to the other, but we see that there are connections, right? That's why I was emphasizing livelihood interventions, rebuilding livelihoods, increasing the resilience of a community can be one of the most important tools in preventing an outbreak of violence. To echo what Karina said about the inconclusiveness of research, is that there is a tremendous gap in research, actually. And there's, most research focuses on Africa, especially the Horn of Africa. And we just finished and published, it's on the CIPRI webpage, a systematic review on the research that exists on South Asia and Southeast Asia, two regions that are highly affected and highly vulnerable to climate change, that have histories of conflict, right? That are host to 1.5 or something billion people, maybe more. And we have 21 studies, rigorous academic studies, 21. Right? So we actually don't know a lot of things. We get some indication that the mechanisms that I just mentioned are also playing out, but we need so much more research in those areas. There's not a single study on Afghanistan, right?
Karina highlighted earlier the completely different impact of different natural resources on the type of conflicts we're seeing. And I think we have to acknowledge the same thing here. The different challenges that come from environmental changes or climate changes and environmental impacts will have different impacts on peace and conflict. And we have different ways of dealing with different issues. And what would be really interesting is to study further how different types of scarcities, for example, impacts conflict globally, and to what extent it leads to cooperation, which is the positive side of this. And it's very hard to predict these things. We know at the local level as well, a natural disaster can be a tremendous source of conflict with looting, extreme violence, etc. But it can also be one of the most positive experiences of a society that really brings people together in cooperation. And what leads to what is so important to understand, because we can then perhaps build on these positive processes. And Florian, you mentioned earlier the missed opportunity in Kosovo when it comes to water management, for example. So that we can see those opportunities when they arise. Yeah, go ahead.
I just have to two-finger myself because I said political violence, right? And I just want to emphasize that nuance. I'm not talking about armed conflict. I'm not talking about civil war. I'm talking about political violence, right? And there are various forms of that. There's communal violence, there are riots, etc. Very broader definition of violence. Just not to, I mean, to make that point that we have a very broad definition there on political violence.
Just to pick up on what you said, the different impacts, the different potential impacts from environment and resources, what the disaster risk reduction literature shows is that within disasters we also have different reactions in the population. Think about an earthquake. It's not like people go around trying to get everything from the supermarkets and start shooting themselves. It's actually quite the opposite. It has a sort of a bring together the society kind of effect. Although it's a disaster, everybody's in need, it has the opposite effect than what we might often hear about environment and natural catastrophes and so on.
Mexico last earthquake was an example to that, actually.
Yes.
I just wanted to add one thing about concepts and going back a little bit to the language that we use. And I was thinking about climate change and how civil society organizations in Colombia relate environment and peace building, and if they talk about climate change. And I would say some of them do. They have very strong links to academia, for example. If they don't mention climate change. As they don't mention shrinking space for civic shrinking space or other things. But what they are talking about, the content, is very strongly related to it. And I can give you two examples. One example is after the peace agreement was signed, the first 6 months after the peace agreement was signed, it was evident that the level of deforestation of the Amazonic rainforest in Colombia increased, potentially. It increased very, very strongly. I don't know if you have followed that. And there was apparently a clear link between the FARC leaving those territories, going to the camps where they were going to be part of the demobilization, and the people who were like waiting to just cut down the trees, cutting them down, both to plant coca, but also because of the use of the woods. So there is a clear link. And actually the communities there had been screaming for a long time, when the FARC leaves, we need to make sure that governance and that the military, but not only the military, a lot of people are here in place. We have to avoid things like, for example, what happened with the woods. So they're not talking about climate change, but they're talking about the natural resources they're seeing there, the woods. And another example would be this relation between water, extractive industries, and especially gold mining in Colombia, and actually the whole debate of the rights of rivers and the rights of forests. There, again, this is community organizations, sometimes linked to NGOs, more professional NGOs, but what they're linking is that it's very clear that if you have gold mining, you're polluting the water with quicksilver, and that quicksilver will affect us all. And that quicksilver will have an effect on biodiversity, etc., etc., etc. They do that analysis. They never mention climate change. That doesn't mean that they're not linking it, even though they're not using the concept. Just wanted to mention that.
Just to pick up on that, we've done workshops and interviews with the mining sector in Colombia, and what we get from people employed and in the sector, it's not that they're there because they like it, because they think it's fun and nice, and they haven't had any health problems because of it. It's because there's no option. And so again, if you're going to remove or you're going to sort of tone down mining or other activities that are not seen as sustainable, you cannot just take it away and leave the void. You need alternatives. Otherwise, this can harm the peace process. And wherever there is a void, it's a really good opportunity for illegality to step in.
Excellent. It feels like we're just getting warmed up, but unfortunately we have to stop at this stage. which is so unfortunate. First of all, I would really like to thank Claudia, Carina, and Florian for really excellent remarks in high-level theoretical issues, but also on-the-ground perspectives. You're all of you excellent in that sense, that you're able to bring both the real-world issues on the ground together with the theoretical approaches that are out there. Your engagement in the audience has been useful as always. This is complex, and it's equally complex to try and summarize a seminar like this. But one of the key things that have come out of this is that we cannot hide from these issues when it comes to post-conflict peace building. There's just no way we can forget about them or close our eyes or try to avoid it because it's too complicated or it's too sensitive or what have you. We have to deal with these issues. It's a matter of building resilience and legitimacy for the future of these peace processes. The environment, climate change has an enormous impact on vulnerabilities, land issues, natural resources, scarcities, etc. And when you're in a context, in a society flooded by weapons, which is the case after war, and with a population that is used to resolving all kinds of conflict with violence, these are particularly important to deal with because every little issue could be the source of an outbreak of violence, which means we have to be really careful. But we probably also should try and avoid this million-dollar question of does climate change and environmental issues lead to war or peace? That's really not the relevant question, I believe. It's rather what processes help us deal with the conflicts that are inevitable. And I'm saying conflicts without the violence prefix here. But the conflicts that are inevitable when it comes to resource scarcities and other challenges. We see them all the time. The question is, how do we manage peace processes and how do we help societies deal with these peacefully? And even, as you highlight in some cases, use these mutual challenges to bring people together and try and build sustainable peace in a society. Thank you so much again for your perspectives. Thank you all for coming. It's been wonderful, and as a final note, a big thank you to the organizers. And I do encourage you all, since I know how much knowledge is in this room, to contribute to these debates. We have 2 forums, excellent for publications on these issues. The Human Security magazine, Mänsklig Säkerhet, of course, and Biståndsdebatten of FUF. So please do, if you have great ideas and you feel you need to write and get things out there and start debating, do write to us and contribute to this debate. It is so important. It's too important to sit quiet. So thank you again, and welcome back in the future.